Hey, running once. Happy New Year. This is Sauce123. I am back in 2014 with Toy Gaming Episode 2. This episode, we're going to look at a couple of pretty simple toy games, at least ones that are quite simple to solve. Simple enough that I'm going to just solve them for you guys today while you're watching. But I think that seeing how they're solved and seeing what the answers to them there can help your game a lot if you've never actually been through them yourself. This should improve your poker game quite a bit. If you have, skip ahead and join us again for the next episode. So, we're going to solve two different games today. The first one is going to be the nuts or air game versus bluff catcher. And that's going to be with some bet size that I'll set beforehand. We'll do a variety of bet sizes and see how that changes things. And the second one will be nuts air versus bluff catcher with no limit bet sizing. So just choosing whatever size is right for maximizing the value of ranges. And I know that I was asked in a recent video about the nuts air versus bluff catcher scenario for no limit and how much to bet. So I know that at least some people are interested in the solution to that game. None of this stuff is new. It's not anything that I'm contributing that no one knows about. It's stuff that's out there. It's just stuff that I think is very important for your development as a poker player and things that it's just important to know backwards and frontwards. So, the way that these games work is that one player who, for simplicity, we're going to have being in position, is going to have either the nuts or air. So he's going to have a completely polarized range, and the other player is going to have a bluff catcher. And then we'll just see, how each player should play at equilibrium. And just to review from last time, we're at a Nash equilibrium, meaning both players playing optimally when neither player can unilaterally increase the expectation of their strategy. So they'll have some strategic options with some hands. For example, they can, fold with some frequency X or call with some frequency Y. And when they can't increase their expectation by changing any of the X, Y values that they're at now, then the game is the equilibrium, and that's true for both players. So the plan for this week is just to solve each game in Card Runners EV in real time while you guys watch. And I'll sort of explain the steps you want to go through, the reasoning steps, I suppose, in order to get to the solution. Although it's not rocket science, I think it'll be pretty easy. And then I'm going to explain some of the applications to poker. So I think that both of these games definitely apply to river situations in No Limit Hold'em and in any other real poker game. And I think that all, world-class players are very familiar with what these games say. Certainly all online world-class players, and the live guys are maybe feeling it out a little bit more, but I think they still sort of get the picture. And you might find that you're making some mistakes according to the results of these games. If you are, then hopefully this will improve your game quite a bit. Here's my Card Runners EV. So first, we're going to look at the nuts or air game versus a bluff catcher. And I'll pick a bet size for us to start with. So what we're going to do, start a new Card Runners EV sim. So I'm not going to get too much into Card Runners EV, but basically what this does is it models the game tree of No Limit Hold'em. And so if we just set values in Card Runners EV that are, well, I talked about this in the previous video, but if we just set values in Card Runners EV that are the same as the toy game, then we can just sort of play around and use this as a way to simulate the toy game without doing everything in pencil and paper. So first what we have to do is we have to give one player a bluff catcher, or distribution of all bluff catchers, and then the other player the distribution of the nuts. So what we're going to do is give the small blind aces or deuces. Aces will be the nuts, deuces will be air, and we'll give the other player kings. And then we'll just set a flop such that this will be nuts or air in the river. So we will go 3-3-3 7, 8. Nuts are air. I will make the pot size 1. And we have now a betting tree that we can look at. So first of all, the big blind can either bet or check. But I think it should be very obvious, just conceptually speaking, that betting can never be better than checking. And we can go back to that later if anyone's confused. But the point being that if the big blind bets, he can only hope to be called. He's only going to be called by aces. Actually, he's going to be raised by aces. And he'll never be called by worse. So obviously betting can't be good. So we can start our tree by having the big blind check, since that's what's called a betting for the big blind would be a dominated option. Or I suppose from now on I'll call him out of position. Now, the small blind, we're going to start with a bet of the pot. So the small blind can either bet pot or check, and the big blind will say can either call or fold. So I think that basically sums up the strategic options for each player that are reasonable. Obviously, since the big blind doesn't ever want to bet, he doesn't ever want to check raise, and since he never has bluffs, and he's bluff catching anyway, he certainly doesn't want to check raise bluff. So the big blind's checking, either calling or folding, and the small blind's betting or checking. So now the question is, which hands does the small blind want to bet or check? And the obvious first step is just to have the small blind bet the nuts. So we just go, okay, small blind bets aces and checks the rest. And this is sort of like how conceptually you want to start thinking about this toy game. Because we've made, 3 very safe assumptions, which is just that bluff catchers get checked and either called or folded, and the nuts always gets bet. And that gives us some sort of like rules that we can start thinking about the game by. So first, we'll do this, and we'll just assume that the big blind always calls. And we'll look at the expectation for the small blind for in position. So the expectation of this decision point is 1 is the entire pot size for the small blind. That's because 50% of the time the small blind wins twice the pot because the big blind's always calling when he has ace-ace, and the other times he's checking back with deuces and losing. But the question is, are we at equilibrium? And the answer is obviously not, because there's this red part right here which says that the big blind is making a losing call. And since that's -1, the big blind can unilaterally increase his expectation by folding. A shortcut to this is we can just use the maximally exploitative play function for the big blind. And we can just say, what's the maximally exploitative play given the small blind bets only aces? We run that, and it's, of course, to fold every single hand. But now, of course, the small blind's expectation is only 0.5, because he's just winning the pot whenever he has aces, and he's never getting called by worse. So now the question is, okay, well, if the small blind's expectation is 0.5 right now, is there any way that he can unilaterally increase his expectation, meaning we're still not equilibrium? The answer is, of course, yes, and we can check this again with the maximally exploitable counter strategy utility. But we can also just say, well, of course, the answer is that he wants to bet bluffs, because he'll win the whole pot when he bets his bluffs now. So that's what we should get when we look at the maximally exploitative strategy. Boom. And now his EV is 1 again, because he wins the pot every single time with his bluffs. And if we do that now, so now we're getting to a strategy that makes a little bit more sense, just in terms of poker sense. We haven't quantified this strategy and been like, how often should we value bet? How often should we bet bluffs? But we know now that we're betting a polarized range, and we know that we're betting both the nuts and bluffs, and that our opponent has a bluff catcher, so we're quote putting him in a tough spot. So I suppose the next thing we want to do is we can just figure out, well, what should happen now? So we should see, okay, well, let's see if he calls with king, is he winning or losing? And the answer, of course, is that he's winning. And he's winning 0.5. half the pot. So in this case, we have to look and see what the expectation of our bluffs is. And of course, our bluffs are now losing. And our expectation is the EV is now 0.5. So I know I've been referencing these already, but you can look at the EV of decision points here. So this just says this EV, equity 50%, EV 0.5, is the big blind's equity and expected value for his whole decision point for the rest of the game tree. And then the same is true for the small blind here. So now we're all the way back down to 0.5. So we sort of mapped out the poles at which the values and the strategies this toy game can take. So we know that if the big blind always folds, the small blind can maximize his expectation of the full pot by just betting everything. If he does that, though, and the big blind always calls, then he'll minimize his expectation at 1/2 because he'll be bluffing too much and the big blind will have a profitable call with his king-king. And we know that if the big blind always calls with king-king, then the small blind should never bluff and he should just always bet his aces and his expectation will be at 1 again. So we have a range of values for the small blind, which his expectation can take in this game. It's somewhere between 0.5 and 1. And probably optimal play will be somewhere in the middle. And the question now is going to be, well, how often should the small blind bet his bluffs in order to make the big blind indifferent between calling and folding? So what we can do now is we can run a graph. Well, let's not do that. We'll do graphs later. I think instead we'll just do this sort of more intuitively. So let's just start with a round number. And we'll start with betting half our bluffs. So he bets aces and deuce 50% of the time. Here we go. So in this case now, small blind's EV is 0.75, which is obviously an improvement on the 0.5 that it was before when we were betting, when he was betting 100% of his bluffs. But it's less than his EV was when the big blind was making the wrong strategic adjustment. So when the big blind was either always calling or always folding, and small blind had the better of him in the exploitation game. So, and now we want to look at the expectation of the big blind's call with his bluff catcher. And it's at 0. It should be obvious, well, it's not obvious, I would say, but the reason why the expectation is 0 is that the big blind's bluff catch is correct an equal percent to his pot odds. So he's getting 2-1, and he wins the pot a third of the time when he calls. That will be an important ratio to remember as a result of this game. So the question is, are we at equilibrium now? The answer is no, although the expectation of this game is at equilibrium. 0.75 is the expectation of the game at equilibrium for small blind, and 0.25 is the expectation of the equilibrium for the big blind. But because the big blind is calling with 100% of his bluff catchers, the small blind can still unilaterally increase the EV of his strategy by never bluffing, and then he'll increase his expectation to 1. So the big blind still has to make an adjustment for us to be at equilibrium. And what that is he has to call somewhat less than 100% of the time. And that's just going to end up being half the time. And if we run that, his expectation, of course, is still 0. And now the expectation of bluffing with deuces is 0, which is equal to the expectation of checking with deuces. So all the strategic options for every player cannot be increased. So the small blind's expectation for checking with deuces is 0, or for betting with deuces is 0, checking is 0. The expectation for a big blind of calling with kings is 0, and folding with kings is 0. And that means that no player can unilaterally increase the value of their strategy at this state of the game, and that means that we are, in fact, at equilibrium. So, as I already said, the small blind wants to bluff with a frequency equal to the big blind's pot odds. Similarly, to be at equilibrium, the big blind wants to call with a frequency so that the small blind's bluffs have an expectation of 0, meaning that he wants to fold for the price that the small blind's bluff is getting. So in this case, if we bet the pot, we need to win the pot 1 time in 2 in order for our bluff to be 0, and therefore the big blind folds 1 time in 2. So we can test this sort of idea by changing the bet size and then seeing the frequencies that would result. So we'll go with half pot first. And obviously, if we run the expectation here, we'll see that the game values are different, and also that the strategies aren't in equilibrium now. So for example, we can look at the maximally exploitative strategy for the small blind now. And of course, it's going to be to bluff everything again. The reason is just because now we're risking half pot to win the full pot. So our bluff only needs to be right a third of the time, but our bluff is being right half the time because the big blind's only calling with half of his bluff catchers. So we can adjust the big blind strategy and be like, okay, so to make the small blind's bluffs neutral, then we have to call 2/3 of the time, given his half pot bet size. So we go up to 67% call frequency, run the EV again, and now, lo and behold, our bluffs are neutral EV. Although because it's 67%, not exactly 2/3, it's negative 0.005 for bluffing, but we can ignore that. So now the small blind has to rebalance his range, given that we know that the big blind's going to be calling 2/3 of the time now. And of course, the answer is that the small blind is going to be giving the big blind 3-1 on a call, so he needs to be bluffing 1 time in 4 now. So we'll just go ace, ace, deuce, deuce, 25%. No, oh, did I do this wrong? Yes, I totally did. What I meant was a third of the time. Yes. There we go. So that's what 3-1 means. So this is usefully formalized by the mathematics of poker guys, which I'll go over in a second. But I think that the principle is pretty straightforward, which is just that we need to bluff with a frequency so that our opponent's bluff catchers have an EV of 0, and he needs to call so that our bluffs don't have a positive expectation in any toy game of this size, of this kind. So, okay. So these are the lessons from the sort of nuts or air versus bluff catcher game. It's dominated, of course, to ever bet a bluff catcher as out of position or to check the nuts as in position. That's extremely obvious, but it's important because it lets us set the bounds of the game. The polarized range should, of course, bet all of its nut hands in a proportion of its bluffs, and that should be equal to out of position's pot odds, and that maximizes in position's expectation versus a clairvoyant opponent. So I guess implicit in this whole card runner's EV analysis, when we're using the maximally exploitative strategy tool and things, is that the other player knows what our strategy is and is going to adjust the best that it can against our strategy. And that's just how you arrive at optimal play, and it's a good assumption to make when you're trying to figure out a tough strategy to play as a default in online games. So this is formalized by the constant alpha. This is from the Mathematics of Poker, page 113, where alpha equals S over S plus 1, where S is the bet size measured in percentage of the pot. And that'll just tell you that for whatever bet size you're making, how often you should be bluffing. So for example, if we're betting pot, S is 1 because the bet size measured in percentage of the pot is 1. We're betting the full pot. So it's 1 over 1 plus 1 equals 2 is 1/2. And that just means that for every value bet that we have, we should bluff with 1/2 frequency. So we're bluffing half as often as we're value betting. and that's the same as our opponent's pot odds of 2-1. And similarly, the optimal defending frequency for the bluff catching player is 1 minus s over s plus 1, or 1 minus alpha. And so you can see that alpha is equal to 1 minus alpha for a pot size bet. That means that in position bets with 1 bluff for every 2 value bets, and out of position calls half the time. And then those values diverge as bets get bigger or smaller. So the next thing we're going to look at is going to be the same idea, except it's going to be maximizing the value of the game for the in-position player by manipulating our bet size. So I think this is maybe obvious for people already, but we already know how to arrive at optimal play for any given bet size. And the question is just, at which bet size do we maximize the value of our range, and by how much? So let's start here with, well, maybe we can think about this, take a step backward and say, well, if we couldn't bet at all, what's the value of the game for us? The value of the game for the small blind is going to be half, because we have the best hand half the time. So if we couldn't bet at all, the EV would be 0.5. And we can already see that if we bet half the pot, our EV is 2/3 of the pot. We're up to 0.67. So clearly, the equity of both players is 50%. So clearly, betting helps the player with the polarized range. Now the question is, how much can we bet in order to maximize the value of our range? And the answer is going to be a lot, because we can't possibly value cut ourselves. Therefore, we want to bet a lot of money. And as you can see, our EV was 0.67 when we bet half pot, and it was 0.75, remember, when we bet full pot. So let's just try 2 times the pot. Okay, so we're betting ace-ace. And then our s over s plus 1 is going to be 2/3. So we're going to bluff with around 67% of our deuces. And 1 minus s over s plus 1 is going to be 33%. So he's going to call 1/3 of the time. And then we can see the expectation of the game. So here the EV is 0.01, the EV is 0.006. That means that we're just about there. We're now betting with 83.5% of our range, and the EV of the game for the small blind is now up to 0.83, which is clearly an improvement on our 2 previous values. So it was an improvement on 0.5 for no betting, an improvement on 0.67 for half pot betting, an improvement on 0.75 for full pot. Now we're at 0.83 with 2x pot. Okay, so let's try 5x pot. So in that case, we're bluffing with 5/6 of a bluff. So I will figure out what the percentage is of 5/6. So 83% of our bluffs, and we'll get called by around 17% of our opponent's bluff catchers at equilibrium, and we're up to 0.92. And we're betting now 91.5% of our range. So I guess a shortcut to get to the idea that we want to bet as much as we can is that at equilibrium, when we have a completely polarized range, anytime we bet, the EV for our opponent is going to be 0. That's because if he calls, his EV is 0, because we'll be bluffing a percentage equal to his pot odds. And if he folds, his EV will be 0, because he just folded. So if we can maximize the percentage of our range that we bet, then we'll be maximizing our expectation at equilibrium. And so now, as you can see, we're up to 91.5% of our range, and things only get better from there. So, I have 150 big blinds set for stacks. So we could bet up to 150. And we would bluff with the frequency 150 divided by 151, or 99%. And he would call around 1%. Of course, now that the rounding errors will actually be pretty big here. But now our EV is approximately 1, basically meaning that we're betting just about our entire range now that we can bet 150 times the pot. And in the infinite case, we bet with 1 bluff for every value bet, basically. So that is how to maximize your expectation when you have a completely polarized range and an infinite stack size. The answer is just you bet as much as you possibly can. And similarly, if you're in a situation like that, you can minimize your opponent's expectation as the bluff catcher by calling with 1 minus alpha percentage of your bluff catchers. And that will minimize out of position or imposition's expectation if he is clairvoyant against you. So, what are the lessons here? This is the NL game. So the polarized player, in this case it was in position with the aces and deuces, wants to bet infinity. That's because no matter how frequently or infrequently the bluff catcher calls, the polarized player can't value cut himself. It's important to note that just because you have ace-king on an ace-queen, or call it an ace-king 6-3-2 board, that doesn't mean you can bet 500 times the pot if you somehow got in that situation, because 5-4 is out there and sets are out there and things like that. So maybe you have a hand that is good 97 or 98% of the time, but not 100% of the time. So you can bet infinity in exactly one case, and that's when you're good 100% of the time. So this is definitely a toy game when you start getting to absurdly big stack sizes. And by betting infinity, this maximizes the volume imposition can put into the pot with his range. So just for example, like 0.5 times the pot is less than 33 percentage times you're betting twice the pot. So the first one would be 0.5, the second one would be 0.66. So you want to maximize the volume you're putting into the pot for value with your nut hands. That's another way to get to the same solution. So betting infinity allows the polarized player to get max value on his hand. And then you add bluffs for balance so that you have to get called sometime and you can't get exploited by having the bluff catcher fold or always call. So the question is, what does this have to do with no limit hold'em? And the answer is, I think, quite a bit, although it's not like this isn't something that you can put into your game and just apply everywhere. It's something that's going to apply in very specific situations, and hopefully the thought process that got us to these solutions helps shed light on other situations in no limit hold'em. The thought process just being that we're at equilibrium when no player can unilaterally increase the value of their strategy. And the idea just being, the process of exploitation has to go back and forth until each player has a strategy that the other player can't do much against. So, in terms of no limit hold'em, the major application of this toy game is on the river. That's for two reasons. First is that there's different rules that govern multi-street games that we'll get to in a later video, I think. And also, hand values are dynamic on the earlier streets, and that's the single biggest reason this doesn't straightforwardly apply to, say, a flop spot. Which is another way of saying that, you might have the nuts, you might have the best hand 98% of the time on the flop, but if your opponent has 40% equity against you with his bluff catchers, then you definitely can't bluff nearly as much. So that's a completely different situation, and do not apply the lessons of this toy game to a situation where there's a lot of draws around on the early streets. So really on the river, this is going to apply pretty straightforwardly, and before that, it won't. That being said, if the board is like, ace, king, 3 rainbow, and you're playing a heads up sit and go, and you have one bet behind, and you get check 2 on the flop. This will kind of apply on the flop, because if you say you're considering value betting an ace, if you bet your ace, he's probably only going to have 12% equity against you with his calling range, and so you can add almost as many bluffs as this game would have you do. Secondly, betting and bluffing ratios in full scale no limit hold'em need to be adjusted for card removal. Even if you do have the nuts, when you do have the nuts, your opponent, that might affect the frequency that your opponent's bluff catches are going to succeed in no limit. So you need to adjust your ratios for that. But I think in most cases, especially if this video is like for you, if you're watching this video and saying, oh, I never thought about this before, then you can probably pretty much ignore card removal to start, would be my advice. And then later on, especially using Card Runner EV and different software that can sort of do card removal for you, you can refine these ratios a bit, looking at card removal effects. So this occurs fairly frequently in No Limit Hold'em, I would say, mostly in spots where one player has a fairly capped range and the other player has a polarized range. So we'll go over a couple examples, but there's a variety of lines where I would say this happens pretty often. And we usually just call these spots where one player has a capped range. And it's not necessarily because the player has to have a capped range, it's just because the way people play is that they have a capped range. And so you might not be exactly at equilibrium in the strict, Nash or game theory sense, because maybe if you are betting really big in situations where your opponent has a capped range, he can unilaterally increase his strategy by slow playing against you, in which case you aren't at equilibrium. But even that being the case, if you just sort of assume that your opponent is playing a certain strategy, you can sort of balance your counter strategy by keeping his strategy fixed using these sort of guidelines. And so examples of lines where your opponent has a capped range in No Limit Hold'em are basically lines where we are the aggressor until the river, typically when the board is kind of dynamic, but also against a lot of players when the board is dry. So for example, bet, bet, bet in a single raise or 3-bet pot. So maybe we're in position, we bet flop, turn, and river, or we 3-bet out of position and bet flop, turn, and river, or maybe we 4-bet and bet flop, turn, river. A lot of times the out of position player will have raised all or most of his nut hands earlier on in the hand, or maybe it's impossible for him to have the nuts because he couldn't have the semi-bluff that ends up making the river nuts. So there's situations where we might just have the stone nuts relative to his range. And if we do, then we should just bet as much as we can. And we should add bluffs in the same way as this says. Also, check raise, bet, bet is another situation where we'll probably be quite polarized compared to his range. After a flop, check, check, when we bet kind of big on the turn and bet in the river, that's another situation where his range will probably be fairly capped. And we'll want to balance our betting range in the river by adding the right number of bluffs for whatever bet size we decide on. Similarly, when it goes check, 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 and then there's a delay c-bet followed by a delay c-bet double barrel, that's another line where you want to balance your river betting range and usually bet fairly big. So I think this comes up pretty much all the time in No Limit Hold'em, and I think that there's a lot of players who are still not doing this well, even though I think almost anyone who's playing fairly high stakes knows this stuff, and they know that they should be bluffing in roughly these ratios. They still mess it up. So I think another thing, even if this is easy for you conceptually, I think it's important to go through your river betting ranges in various situations and see if you're balancing your range correctly. Figure out how many of your turn semi-bluffs you have to bet with on the river in order to balance your value bets for whatever bet size you choose. So I think this is very, very applicable to No Limit Hold'em. So here's an example, a No Limit Hold'em example from our first game, which was the pot size bet, roughly, polarized range game. So say we 3-bet and get called. The flop comes down ace-10-4 rainbow, turns a deuce and a river is a deuce, and say we bet the turn and arrive at the river. I would say, so first we want to look at the situation. So we arrive at the river on ace-10-4 deuce-deuce in a 3-bet pot, and we have to think to ourselves, okay, do we have a polarized range? And what does our range look like? And this is typically an example where there's typically a situation where we are going to have a polarized range because our 3-betting range is going to have a lot of big aces and big pairs, especially when we decide to bet the flop and turn. So, we'll probably have a lot of hands like ace-king, ace-queen, aces, or tens. in our range that will definitely want to shove. And we probably won't have very many hands that want to bluff catch. It would be probably a bad line to get to the river in this situation with like 10-9 or, pocket jacks or ace-3. All those hands would want to check here. They probably wouldn't want to bluff either, but we just won't have those hands. But luckily for us, if we want to get called at least, we'll also show up at the river with a lot of hands that are pretty much air. We'll show up with like king-queen and queen-jack. And for simplicity, we'll just assume that we've 3-bet, all of our king-queen, all of our queen-jack hands. And that's how we play them to get to the river. And those hands, while they might beat some hands on the flop with king or queen high, are probably not going to beat any hands that our opponent gets the river with after we've bet twice in a 3-bet pot. So, our opponent's worst hand would probably be something like 10-9 or jack-10 here, or maybe king-queen or queen-jack himself. We won't beat any of those hands. And certainly if we check king-queen or queen-jack, he'll probably bluff with any hands that we might beat at showdown. So for more or less, we will never win at showdown. And that means that we have a polarized range, and probably most of our opponent's range will be, ace-jack, ace-9, ace-8 type hands, in which case our ace-king, ace-queen are, effectively the nuts. And so we know that we can profitably value bet with our ace-king / ace-queen hands. And we know that we need to bluff with at least some of our king, queen, and queen jack hands. And having looked at these toy games, we can answer the question, well, how much should we bluff? And the quick answer is that we basically just want to bluff with, in this case, about half of our missed draws. So obviously we're making a pot size bet, so we want to be bluffing with half a combination for every one combination that we value bet. So it's pretty easy in this situation to figure it out. We can just sort of match up the fact that we have, so any 2-card offsuit / suited combination is going to be equally frequent. So any ace-king / ace-queen is going to be about as frequent as king-queen and queen-jack. So more or less we want to bluff with one of our misdraws and give up with one in order to maximize our EV at equilibrium. So in this case, to make that a little bit more precise, we can do the card removal, which is just that we have 12 combos of each ace because one ace is dead because it's on the board. And we have 3 combos of each set because one of the set cards is dead in each case because it's on the board. So we have 12 combos plus 12 combos plus sleep plus 3 is 30 combos for value. And we have 32 combos of bluffs because we just have 16 of each king-queen / queen-jack combo. Because we have the offsuit and the suited variety. So we should actually bet 15 combos of our bluffs to balance our 30 value bets because alpha is going to be 0.5 in this case. So we just bluff with 0.5 times 30 equals 15 combinations. But half is probably close enough. I don't think you need to worry about that. So at the table, the idea is just to get a betting frequency that is reasonable and is going to put our opponent in a tough spot. Not one that's going to be completely exact. So I think it's important to think of things geometrically almost as opposed to mathematically. So we want to be like, okay, so I have ace-king and ace-queen, and I'm bluffing with, king-queen and queen-jack, and I have a couple of sets, but those aren't very frequent, and there's some card removal. So I need to bluff with one of those because I have 2 value bets, and I have, around 2 bluffs, so I bluff with one of them. I think that's kind of the thought process you want to go through when you're getting comfortable with these concepts as opposed to, trying to do mental math or something like that because you're not going to have time. It's sort of like a fitting pieces together mindset, I think. Similarly, this sort of exercise is going to let us know how to adjust our range based on mistakes our opponent is making. So we know that if he's folding more than around 50%, we're going to have profitable bluffs. And we know that he should be calling us with around half of his bluff catchers. So maybe we have a good read that, we think he's calling with ace-jack and ace-9, but we know that he 4-bets, ace-jack suited for value or something. So we'll be like, okay, so that means that he's going to only have 3/4 of his ace-jack combos, but all of his ace-9 combos. So that means that since ace-jack should be, as frequent as ace-9, but he's bluffing with some of his or value betting some of his ace-jack combos, that means he'll be calling less often than he should. And then this sort of framework can give us lots of choices about how to exploit that mistake by our opponent. We might say something like, okay, well, I'm going to bluff with all of my king-queen combos and half of my queen-jack combos, which is 50% more often than I should be bluffing. But I'm not going to bluff with all of my combos because I don't want my opponent to readjust. Or we might decide to bluff with every single combo and take advantage of what we think is our opponent's mistake. Or we might not be as confident in our opponent's mistakes. We might decide to bluff with, a few more combos than we're supposed to. So can adjust, all of our different ratios exploitatively as well, deep as understanding exploitive play as deviations from optimal ranges. So I think this is sort of a useful situation that's going to come up in a lot of 3-bet pots in the river and certainly in lots of other situations too. The second example is one for the second toy game we did, the No Limit Polarized Range game. And this one is maximizing value with the nuts. So clearly, whenever we have the nuts, as we've learned, we can bet, our stack. And obviously, since we can never value cut ourselves, betting our stack is going to be best. But there's lots of situations where that might not actually be best because there might be card removal effects, or we might want to balance other parts of our range, or our opponent might check raise us, or all kinds of different things. But I think that there's a lot of situations in poker where we're leaving lots of money on the table by not just betting our stack in certain situations. So I just want to go over that. This is from a 50-100 ante-game I recently played. And I opened to 300 in the cutoff with Jack-8 suited. And Haley called me in the big blind. And the flop came down, ace of clubs, 7 of spades, 4 of diamonds. So, a pretty innocuous flop. I think I had Jack-8 of... It says that Jack-8 of spades here. I had some Jack-8 combo that was suited that I would open from the cutoff. And he checked, I c-bet 450 into 700, which is sort of a standard c-bet size for me on this flop. And clearly I have a hand with a couple of pretty sketchy backdoor straight draws and a backdoor flush draw, and a hand with basically no showdown value. So it's a hand that is a pretty reasonable c-bet, especially given the fact that, I have a lot of nut combos in my range because he just flat called from the big blind. So I c-bet, he calls. In which case, now his range is going to be narrowed somewhat. So I'm going to, think to myself, okay, so he probably has any ace, any 7, probably any 4, and he probably definitely has 8s or better, any flush draw or any gutter. And he might have a hand like, like king queen with a backdoor flush draw, something like that. But obviously I'm behind every hand in his range. But importantly, after he calls the flop, I know that he doesn't have Jack-8. Now it's not important normally, but it's going to be important in this hand. So the turn's the 9 of diamonds, bringing a flush draw. He checked, and I bet 1,200 into 1,600. I don't have the exact details of this hand, but that's approximately what I bet. So I turned the gutter, and I decided to barrel. It's a pretty thin barrel in this spot because he'll have quite a few strong hands. But this time I decided to barrel. I don't always barrel here. And he calls. And then the river's the 10 of clubs, so the flush doesn't come in, and I have the stone cold nuts. He checks, and the question is how much to bet with Jack-8 of spades and an 8K stack. So the pot is now going to be 4,000 on the river, and I'm going to have 8K behind. I think this is a spot where a lot of players would just straight up make a mistake, and not because they didn't understand the situation, but just because they would just pick a standard bet size that they make with their range, and they would make that bet size, and they would hope to get check raised by sets and stuff like that. And they'd hope to get value from ace X, and they wouldn't really realize that they could squeeze some more value out of their range by just shoving in this spot. So the quick answer here is that shove is probably best. My range plausibly contains both straights as well as many misdraws. That's key here when we're deciding to make a shove. So because I have a wide range from the cutoff, and because Haley has a not particularly nutty range from the big blind, and also because so many backdoor straight draws and flush draws came in with the 9 of diamonds turn, Like I said, I wouldn't even always barrel Jack 8 on the turn there, but I did. But the point being that because I wouldn't always double barrel my Jack 8, that means that I could have so many bluffs in this spot that I'm never going to run out of bluffs. So I have a very polarized range with plenty of bluffs. So also I have every other nut hand that's in his range. So I have, I probably don't have ace-4 offsuit, but I have, all of the sets and all of the suited ace-x combos, and probably not pocket nines, but I have plenty of nut combos that I can bet call here with. And critically, for Haley can never have either of the straights because he can't ever really call the turn with 8-6 unless it's specifically 8-6 of diamonds, which is very unlikely. And he definitely can't check call the flop with Jack 8. So I have duplicated all of his bluff catching combos, but I just have the nuts on top of that. So it's pretty clear that this is a situation where I can just shove if I want, since I have plenty of bluffs, and that's definitely what I should do. So I can make a smaller bet size with a lot of other hands and bet call that. But jamming is probably going to maximize my EV with the nuts, especially since I don't block his bluff catchers, since his bluff catchers will mostly be sets and two pairs and ace-x. So I think that's a spot where I actually get a good amount more value out of my nut hand. Admittedly, it doesn't come up very often. But when you do have the nuts, you don't want to miss value with it. And I think this adds a lot of value to my range in this spot. So just want to go over both of these spots in Card Runners EV quickly before we go, just to take you guys through them a little bit more detail. So here we go. We've got ace 10 4, deuce deuce, and we'll start in the river, and we'll make the small blinds range in this case is a bluff catcher. So because I don't want to deal with card removal right now, I'm going to cheat a little bit and make his range exactly 10-9, we'll say. And the big blinds range will be these hands for value, as well as the gutters for bluffs. So the big blind in this case is going to be either shoving for pot or checking, in which case the small blind, we won't deal with the small blinds range at this point. We'll just assume the small blind wins the pot when we check. So we'll just assume he bets and we always fold. So we already know what we want to bet for value, so we can just start with that. So we just say, okay, so we want to bet at least top pair. See what percentage of our range that is. That's 47% of our range. And then we know, because we're betting pot, that we want to bluff, around 23.5% of our range. So we want to bluff half as much as we're value betting, because we're giving him 2-1. So then we'll go and we'll look in Card Runners EV and we'll say, okay, 10, we'll say king, queen, or we'll bluff with our worst bluff just for fun. We'll see exactly how much that is. That ends up being a little bit too much just because of the card removal effects that I was talking about before. So instead, we're going to go ahead and bluff a little bit less than that. So we'll bluff with, say, 85%. And here his call is very slightly losing, but anytime it's, in the second decimal place, that's close enough for me. And then he should be calling about half the time with his bluff catcher. And then our EV is maximized at about 0.7 with our 46.7% equity. And that's, as you can see, that's very close to the expectation for the toy game, where our EV was 0.75 with the polarized range when we had 50% equity. So these things are, these are very, very analogous situations. And this is a situation that I think comes up quite often in No Limit. And we can definitely tweak this a little bit if you want. You guys can do this on your own, or we can talk about it in the comment section. We can tweak it a little bit if the small blind's calling range has an ace in it, in which case we have to be a little bit more careful with our bluffing frequency, because he will block some of our value hands when he has an ace. So that's that, and then we'll do a new sim here for the start on the flop for the Jack-8 case. So the flop here is going to be ace 7-4. The turn is going to be a 9 of diamonds, and the river will be the 10 of spades. We'll make a small blind hand range here of these default ranges are pretty weak. Do a range of something like this. This isn't, probably the best range, but it's something, 32% for the cutoff, and we'll have the big blind defending some hands. We'll do something like that. This is going to be pretty imprecise, but that's okay. It's just to illustrate the point. So some of these would definitely be 3-bets as well, but that's fine. We'll just do a sort of pretty vanilla, bland range. So we'll make it, we have 150 big blinds in this case, and the pot will be around 7 big blinds. So the big blind checks, and we bet. And in this case, we'll just bet with at least top pair, gut shot or more, backdoor flush draw, just for fun. And the big blind will either call or fold. This will be the worst case scenario with us because he's never check raising the flop with the range that I said before. This is, again, pretty rough and ready ranges. And we'll be betting 4.5. Here we'll say we're betting with at least a gutter, flush draw, or chop pair third kicker, shall we say. We'll say the big blind only calls or folds. So here he calls with a flush draw or mid pair. And then so he checks down the river, and then he checks, and we can either bet a normal size or stacks with some range that we'll look at in a second. And well, I'll use the 2x pot that we had. So in our range will be Jack-8 suited. We'll bet it half the time for one size and half the time for the other size and compare their expectations. Otherwise, say we're folds. And here we'll say, we'll figure out he calls with the frequency that makes this indifferent here. So for a bet size of 32, just to practice our equation, 32 divided by 72. So he has to call with around 56% of his range. So we'll say that's, just take a quick look. We'll assume that that's at least top pair for now. And for 80, he has to call with around a third of his range. Say it's at least 2 pair for now. We can run this, see if we've got the frequencies right. That's way too much. Okay. Please. I actually need to get some more combos here. Get a couple more sims. I suppose the sample size will be tough because I have so few combos. I think this is probably just about right. I need to add a few here. We'll add ace jack and just keep this one. Okay. Should be just going to adjust these so that he's at a reasonable defending frequency for both options. So that's about right. He's defending a little bit less in both options, but that's reasonable. So in this case, as you can see from our turn range here, when we were betting 12, we're going to have plenty of gutters and flush draws. Although in this case, we're going to also have many top pairs. I suppose my cutoff range would actually be a bit wider than this, but that's sort of beside the point. But then on the river, we're going to have enough bluffs that we should be able to follow through with lots of them. And if we bet the small size, our expectation is 56. And if we bet the big size, our expectation is 65. So, I mean, that's not a huge deal, but it would be, about an 11 big blind, a 9 big blind mistake to pick the wrong bet size here on the river. And maybe that only happens to you once every 100 hands, but if you make the right bet size in that situation, that can be the difference between being a break-even player and a 9 BB per 100 winner. So I think that paying attention to bet size in spots like this is going to be important, and I think looking at how your distribution and your opponent's distribution interact is going to be the way to do that. And these toy games can sort of give us some guidelines about how to size our bets in different situations. So this has been Sauce123 for runonestuff.com. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.